University and University of Technology Sydney, who are graciously hosting us this evening, so thank you. Tonight we hear from leading Dutch photographer Iwan Baan. He's known for, as he describes it, photos that narrate the life and interactions that occur within architecture. He's interested as much in the communities that interact with the buildings as the buildings themselves. He's documented the works of some of the guests we've already seen this year at Sydney Design Week Open with their Chapel of Sound and Francis Carre's Gando Primary School, amongst many others. His works grace the pages of architecture, design and lifestyle publications such as the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Architectural Record and Architectural Digest. After he presents his keynote, he'll then be joined on stage for a conversation with Elias Redstone, who is a curator and writer recognised for his contributions to contemporary photography. He founded Photo Australia and Photo International Festival of Photography. His curatorial practice includes the Venice Architecture Biennale, the London Festival of Architecture, MoMA and Tate Modern. Can I get you please to give a very warm welcome, Iwan Baan.
Thank you so much. It's so nice to be back here in Australia. I'm not so often here, so it's great to have this opportunity here to show a little bit of my work. I'm not sure, I think I have to stand here. I thought you probably know a little bit my work from the design and the architecture pages. Of course, a lot of my commissioned work is for architects from all over the world. But my background is more into documentary photography, so I thought I'll show you a little bit like how I came to this field of architecture. This was in 2004, and kind of by coincidence I met Rem Koolhaas, the Dutch architect, and from one day to another I was sort of catapulted in the whole architectural field. It was a very interesting moment in time at that moment where the office was doing a lot of the work in China, like this massive building, the CCTV building, which was coming up there. And I proposed to Rem to start following that construction. I thought there was another story to tell on like how something like that, something so forward-looking design was being built under these conditions in China, in Beijing, which was like in this sort of massive change at that moment in time. There was a lot coming up in preparation for the Olympic Games. So like there was all these massive buildings coming up at the same time, like this city being changed like kind of overnight. There was this influx of all the migrant workers who were coming from the countryside, building these sort of massive buildings. But then also like CCTV was this kind of amazing structure coming up, like from the very early beginning, before there's any sort of real architecture or building, like the structure kind of foreshadows like what was coming there, like that building is all kind of structure coming up. And then at the same time it's just these being built there with, like at moments there were 10,000 construction workers on site who lived there on site, had their whole own community basically, living in these barracks around the construction site and almost building it by hand. And so that sort of whole story, that juxtaposition of these two different worlds was totally fascinating for me, and really sort of my introduction into architecture, and like literally kind of growing with the building up. So it was like, a massive change there at that moment in time in China. So this project, a lot of the other Western architects who were building things there, the whole country which was in this massive push of modernity. At the same time, like the construction of the Olympic Stadium by Herzog and de Meuron, kind of a similar condition like this. It is extremely powerful structural concept, but then the juxtaposition with the people who are actually building it almost by hand, living there on a construction site 24/7, having sort of their daily routines, like countryside before, but then suddenly transplanted almost to this kind of new background. So that was a kind of big sort of opening of China at that time, and what was growing there. So from there I started working with a lot of architects, but at the same time, like, all these stories around it, around architecture, were really fascinating for me, like sort of stepping away from just that building. So I got more and more commissions for architects like Zaha Hadid and others, but that sort of juxtaposition for me is always very important, to step away from a building, just not only show the architecture, but really give it a sense of place. Like, this is Zaha Hadid in Baku, and yeah, when you see that the modernity of the building, but then also that big contrast with the surrounding environment, I think that's something what brings me to these places, and what I try to show in these places. Here, like, Rem Koolhaas, Qatar National Library, this sort of incredible big open space with these large voids and so, but then again kind of stepping away and getting that larger perspective of the city and see how the city has grown around it. I think that's what fascinates me the most, and what brings a place like a piece of architecture really back to a city. So it's a lot of these commissions which bring me always around the world, and I started going a lot to Japan. This is Nishizawa in the north of Japan, with a beautiful museum, and they're also like, it's always like you're open to these different environments, and Japan is always fantastic with the sort of the precision of the architecture. Everything is like it tells a story on itself, and then you're walking around there, and it's very much being in that moment. And then there's this old lady coming up at the same time, sort of someone almost from outer space, watering the flowers, which are planted fantastically in the right order. And it's these kind of moments. Or here in Naoshima, with all the fantastic Tadao Ando buildings, and you walk around there, there's the beautiful Neki de Sanfal, and then suddenly this woman appears in almost a kind of similar dress, the boy kissing the statue. And it's these kind of moments which you try as a photographer to really tell a story on a place, and what makes the place specific. Toyo Ito and Nishizawa, so that kind of group of architects started growing, and that Japan is always fantastic with its combination of architecture, precision in architecture and nature, but the kind of very curated nature, like Junya Ishigami here, with this beautiful underground restaurant, what he built there, and everything is like combined with plants, architecture, space, fantastic design. Or like a park which he designed here with like 50 or 60 small water ponds. Like, there's a combination of an extreme high-tech, extreme design, but a kind of design through nature, like all these full grown trees which were planted in very specific places to create a kind of architecture in a park. And that's always these the juxtapositions, like here with Toyo Ito in Taiwan, where I did this fantastic performing arts center, where like there's almost no straight space, like floors become walls, become ceilings, and it's sort of this continuous form. But then when you step back and you see that huge juxtaposition of like a completely new city which is coming up, and these sinuous forms kind of in the back, suddenly it places it there in that specific context. These are some recent photographs I did on a tour with Rem Koolhaas along the Pearl River Delta, where we're documenting the whole Pearl River Delta 30 years after he did this book with his Harvard students on the Pearl River Delta. And last year we made that same trip again. there you see that amazing juxtaposition of like that modernity growing in China, this sort of endless generic buildings coming up, and also sometimes, yeah, that how that works or doesn't work with contemporary architecture. This is one of the projects of Open, Li Hu and so, who I've been working with for a long time, this beautiful sun tower. But then also like, yeah, it's this incredible piece of architecture, but then a juxtaposition with this sort of endless Chinese backgrounds there are quite incredible. I was there during the solstice. It's like basically this giant sundial, a combination of a kind of sundial, a building shaped by the sun, but then also kind of a museum and exhibition center. So that's a moment in time, the seasons, the particular moment that you're there is, as a photographer, always really interesting. Stephen Hall here in the north of Norway, where he did this museum, and you're there in the middle of the summer, 24 hours, it's light, kids are in the middle of the night outside jumping off the bridge, but also like coming back then in the middle of the winter where it's all snow and the building suddenly has a very different appearance and is almost this kind of silhouette in the snow, or ensemble. And over the years I've been working also with a lot of artists who are making larger art interventions, like Oliver Eliasson here in Qatar, or this moment with Christo, where he finally built his large mastaba building in the Serpentine Pond in London, and that moment where he sees it for the very first time, standing in front of his life's work, but also that moment where the sun is in the back and almost projects his shadow on the building, and it's this sort of very particular moment. So yeah, these architectural commissions bring me around the world to very different places. Selbes Cano, Spanish architects who did a wonderful project here in Kenya, another one in one of the largest informal settlements there in Kenya. And you're flying over these places, again kind of removing yourself, and you see that kind of texture of a city, which brings it back really to that place, this sort of endless corrugated steel roofs which give a texture of that place. And you start to see also a lot of similarities between these places. Caracas, Venezuela, with 70% of the population who lives in these informal neighborhoods, kind of draped over the mountains. Tokyo, with its rivers and the highways, like from far away you see also like how these cities grow over time and are also tell a very specific story. Kyoto with its large imperial gardens, these kind of super blocks in the city. Hong Kong, Sao Paulo, and so on. So these, they're all telling a story like how a city grows, and sometimes also the perilous moments, like Miami here, and you see it like literally sitting like almost inches above the sea level. New York, which I've photographed many times over the years. And then sometimes you're in a very particular moment there. This was in 2012 when a big storm came over New York and knocked out the power for 6 days over New York. And I happened to have the right contact and pilot who could fly me out there and took that picture of the city half in its darkness without electricity and half in the lightness, and it became a cover for New York Magazine and became a kind of iconic image for that moment in time. So yeah, a lot of my projects are always, the building, the architecture brings me to that place, but that context interests me a lot, and I'm usually in a helicopter flying over, and then your eyes are also caught by the very specific conditions of a place. So over the last couple of years, I was a couple times in Houston, Texas, and always have a helicopter for these projects, and got kind of amazed by the sprawl of Houston, this sort of small downtown with a couple of high rises, but then the sort of endless sprawl, the endless highways, and there's a kind of highway network which kind of eclipse anything else, like Los Angeles or these other places. Like there's these places with these kind of incredible flyovers, incredible infrastructure, and the endless sprawl of the city. So then slowly you start working, these architectural commissions bring you to a place, but then you start working on these other projects where, yeah, this became a whole series on this incredible infrastructure of Houston with its 25-lane highways, the non-planning of the city, like literally everything is next to each other, housing, highways, infrastructure, industrial places, oil refineries, and that whole city is just this complete mix of all these things. All these big neighborhoods which are planned, like they all have a sort of water feature with a nice fountain in there, but it's also kind of there are these holding basins for when storm surges come, because the whole place is also like inches above sea level and easily gets flooded. So there's this ominous sign almost all the time, also there in your face. And you see like how everything is right next to each other, like housing, oil refineries, and everything is kind of on top of each other almost. So over the last couple of years I did a number of these flights over Houston, became this whole series on that infrastructure and kind of how a city is built, and also like the specificity of a place like that. We made a publication out of that, and the exhibition actually just opened last week in Houston. And it's always nice to bring back these kind of places to a city which you're documenting from a very different perspective as a photographer, and suddenly see that relationship and a kind of different part of a city which you don't see so much when you're actually on the ground there and live there. And the proximity of this place, like this massive infrastructural and industrial landscape, oil landscape, which kind of fueled the whole growth of the city. But also the proximity of these kind of places, and you see like how close it actually is once you're up there in the sky and see the proximity of that place, and how everything is right next to each other. From like here, kind of recreational housing, but out there in the Gulf, and refineries, and also like everything sits there just inches above sea level. And then you're working on these kind of projects, and it's always one thing kind of brings you back into another thing. So at some point last year I got a call from the Maxi Museum in Italy. They knew that I was working on this project on the Houston highways, and they said like, this year it's the 100th anniversary of the Italian Highway Authority. So are you interested to work on something like that? And I thought like, that's a very different highway. There's nothing like that massive highways, but you have the incredible Italian landscapes. Everything in Italy is wonderfully designed, from bridges, that infrastructure, how graciously it all sort of sits in that in the history of Italy and so on. So I proposed to document that highway system and all that infrastructure also from the air. I flew for a week all over Italy, and it's like a complete opposite, of course, as Houston. It's again kind of that big difference of these kind of places, and how it sort of undertunnels the Italian landscape and so on. And then you try to find something specific for that place. This was so much about the landscape, so part of that series I did with special camera and infrared camera, which really highlights the landscape, all the greenery kind of really lights up, and the kind of man-made infrastructure that everything what's built becomes almost this sort of graphic black line through the landscape, and really makes that man-made part stand out in a very different way. So it's always like, these architectural commissions bring me to these places. You're often working in a very fast